Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this celebration of the life of Richard Gooder. It is a matter of personal regret that I knew Richard for only a short time, the time that I've been the master here at Clare College. In that time, I knew him in his wheelchair-bound years, and then only for his occasional visits to Clare, invariably for celebratory events. There was never any suggestion that I spotted of anger or self-pity or blame in connection with his lot. On the contrary, and subject to one issue, he was always positive, upbeat, enthusiastic, and charming. I believe the one issue that Richard had was the absence of a wheelchair lift, which would have enabled him to be brought, of course by Jean, to the combination room that sits up there just above this great hall. On that point, and although he never expressed it to me, my sense was that Richard was rather aggrieved, and rightly so, because he was deprived of the convivial pre- and post-dinner fellowship experience which he had always enjoyed at Clare and which I am sure he greatly missed. I'm delighted to report that the long-standing deficiency will soon be corrected because the Old Court refurbishment plans contemplate the introduction of a lift. Richard, alas, did not live long enough to enjoy that facility, but he knew that it would be done for the future, and I hope that gave him a degree of pleasure and reassurance. I should on this occasion also record Richard and Jean's enormous generosity in their endowment of a junior research fellowship tenable here at Clare and at Nahum, which is Jean's college. And we thank them for their great generosity. You will see from today's programme that we shall celebrate Richard's life with a very special selection of readings, of music, and there will be two addresses, one from Professor Geoff Ward, who was and is a distinguished ex-student of Richard's, and a separate address by the famous New Yorker cartoonist and great friend of Richard's, Edgar Koren. There will also be some concluding words from my distinguished predecessor, Professor Tony Badger, and final thanks from Ben Gooder. Now, Richard was not a religious man, and I hope I may be forgiven for concluding with a biblical, but I think universal thought. There is a famous posuk or sentence in Psalm 90, which translates into English as, and I quote, "Teach us rightly to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." Richard made full use of his allotted time, with his love for Jean and all of his family, his devotion and commitment to many generations of adoring students. We were reminded of this by Richard's former pupil, Professor Fred Parker, who gave the eulogy here on the occasion of Richard's funeral. And we all recall Richard's infectious warmth and enthusiasm for this college and its fellowship. Richard was a man full of integrity, and he made every day count. There can be no doubt that Richard gained a heart of wisdom.
This prose poem was chosen to represent my father's Quaker upbringing in Cincinnati, Ohio. Go placidly amid the noise and the haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly. and listen to others, even to the dull and the ignorant, for they too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexatious to the spirit. If you compare yourself with others, you may become vain or bitter, for always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. Enjoy your achievements as well as your plans. Keep interested in your own career, however humble. It is a real possession in the changing fortunes of time. Exercise caution in your business affairs, for the world is full of trickery. But let this not blind you to what virtue there is. Many persons strive for high ideals, and everywhere life is full of heroism. Be yourself. Especially, do not feign affection. Neither be cynical about love, for in the face of all aridity and disenchantment, it is as perennial as the grass. Take kindly the counsel of the years, surrendering gracefully the things of youth. Beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. And whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive him to be. And whatever your labors and aspirations, in the noisy confusion of life, keep peace in your soul. With all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. Be cheerful and strive to be happy.
Have you seen the bright lily grow before rude hands have touched it? Have you marked the fall of the snow before the earth hath smutched it? Have you felt the wool of beaver or swan's down ever? Or have smelt of the bud of the briar or the nod in the fire? Or have tasted the bag of the bee? Oh, so white, oh, so soft, oh, so sweet is she, so sweet is she. Have you seen the bright lily grow before rude hands have touched it? Have you marked the fall of the snow before the earth had smutched it? Have you felt the wool of beaver or swan's down ever? Or have smelt of the bud of the briar or the nod in the fire? Or have tasted the bag of the bee? Oh, so white, oh, so soft, oh, so sweet. So sweet is she.
The Day Lady Died by Frank O'Hara. It is 12:20 in New York, a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day, yes, It is 1959, and I go get a shoe shine, because I will get off the 419 in East Hampton at 7:15 and then go straight to dinner, and I don't know the people who will feed me. I walk up the muggy street beginning to sun and have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go on to the bank, and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look up my balance for once in her life. And in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bonnard, although I do think of Hesiod, trans Richmond Lattimore, or Brendan Behan's new play, or Le Balcon, or Les Nègres of Genet, but I don't. I stick with Verlaine after practically going to sleep with quandariness. And for Mike, I just stroll into the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega, and then I go back where I came from, to 6th Avenue and the Tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater, and casually ask for a carton of Gauloise and a carton of Picayune and a New York Post with her face on it, and I am sweating a lot by now, and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5-spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing.
I met Richard for the first time when I came up to Clare in 1972. He taught me. The supervisor-supervisee relationship had aspects that are probably no longer commended as best practice. If the supervision began at noon, he would pour me a glass of sherry and offer me a Turkish cigarette crafted by Sullivan Powell. I've never cared massively for sherry. I enjoyed the cigarettes, but I was always happy to take a glass with him because of the conviviality, the sense of sharing a space and time which extended beyond these props of sociability into our conversations about literature. I had no way of knowing then that these conversations would, happily, continue for over 40 years. As a counterweight to his erudition, which could so easily have floored me, Richard used other vocalized reference points that would recur like scholarly running gags across the hours of supervision. He was fond of alluding, while talking about Elizabethan drama, to Norton and Sackville's The Tragedy of Gorboduc, 1561, or Thomas Preston's Cambyses, King of Persia, 1569, plays whose very existence he appeared to think preposterous, but somehow necessary in the literary scheme of things. Inter alia, he was, I guess, showing me that a spoonful of levity can oil the wheels of thought and need not diminish or dilute the sense we both shared that literature matters more than almost everything. In particular, we came to share a love of the American poet Frank O'Hara, whose elegy for Billie Holiday we just heard read, a writer to whom the profound and the throwaway are magically intertwined. Richard was in Cambridge, but an American in Cambridge, and his urbanity encompassed with an American directness all and any things that came its way. I would learn that this was not ubiquitous in 1970s Cambridge, where even the most sumptuously furnished fellows' rooms could still carry a whiff of the anchorite's cell. Richard's did not. Cambridge could be socially intimidating too, initially. Crucial here is the fact that the discrete human being, Richard Gooder, was also a component part of that great force for benignity, the Gooders. That force has propelled many students, gently, sensitively, but decisively, into not being intimidated and into challenge of oneself, not least. Richard's and Jean's hospitality, conversational, culinary, complete, has been a constant star in my life, as for many others. Looking after students involves at times a necessary element of parenting, when to let go, where to draw lines, when not to be surprised. However, Richard had an unexpected influence on my own life as a parent. I might never have heard of that unique school, Bedales, which both my sons attended, had it not been for the Gooders. In sum, I felt I could always trust Richard's judgment, be it of books, or wine, or people, or a school. How different my life would have been had I not known him. We exercised a different sort of judgment as fellow editors of the literary journal, the Cambridge Quarterly, founded in 1966, of which Richard would in time become senior editor. Some of my fellow editors are here today, and we feel our leader's loss keenly. There were some difficult characters on the board at points, and I marvelled at Richard's patience over the years as much as I did his habit of going straight back to first principles and revisiting very regularly the issue of what the journal was for, which I found as stimulating as I found it mildly unnerving. He had no time for the lazy, pretentious, or derivative submissions we occasionally received, and had a particularly sharp eye for essays which hid an essential vacuity behind a peacock fan of critical theory. I don't remember my last meeting with Richard. I didn't know it was going to be that. I do, however, remember the last conversation with him I had that really counted. We were talking about the passage of time, about our children and the changes they go through, about the regrettable fact that one won't always be around to see them because, and here came Richard's characteristic sudden smile, on one level it's all like a novel. You just want to know what's going to happen next. Well, you'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to finish by reading you a novel, but rather a short poem by Frank O'Hara's contemporary and friend, John Ashbery. John Ashbery appeared at a Cambridge Poetry Festival in the mid-1970s, reading from his about-to-be-famous self-portrait in a convex mirror in the evening following an afternoon spent with the Gooders. The poem I'm going to read, Paradoxes and Oxymorons, is about how poems work and think, and how, while we are thinking about things in them, other mysterious transactions take place, which keep poetry, as it was for Richard, of absolute importance. John Ashbery, Paradoxes and Oxymorons. This poem is concerned with language on a very plain level. Look at it, talking to you. You look out a window or pretend to fidget. You have it, but you don't have it. You miss it, it misses you. You miss each other. The poem is sad because it wants to be yours and cannot. What's a plain level? It is that and other things, bringing a system of them into play. Play? Well, actually, yes. But I consider play to be a deeper outside thing, a dreamed role pattern, as in the division of grace, these long August days, without proof, open-ended. And before you know it, it gets lost in the steam and chatter of typewriters. It has been played once more. I think you exist only to tease me into doing it on your level, and then you aren't there or have adopted a different attitude. And the poem has set me softly down beside you. The poem is you.
To ask for all thy love and thy whole heart to a madness. I do not see nor can admit fairest from you to have all, yet to give receiveth all hath nothing to impart but sadness. He that receiveth all can have no more than seeing. My love by length of every hour gathers new strength, new growth, new flower. You must have daily new rewards in store, still being. You cannot every day give me your heart for merit. Yet if you will, when yours doth go, you shall have still one to bestow. For you shall mine when yours doth hence depart, inherit. Yet, if you please, I'll find a better way than change them. For so, Lord, dearest, we shall be one and one, another's all. Let us so join our hearts that nothing may estrange them. For so, Lord, dearest, we shall be one and one, another's all. Let us so join our hearts that nothing may estrange them.
As children, Ben, Kate and I were read to often by both Mama and Pop. I think we all loved the sound of his voice when he did Uncle Remus and Brer Rabbit. Likewise, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. But I particularly remember him reading Edgar Allan Poe, which he did in a sort of deep, gravelly voice, very seriously, but also in a tone which had a sort of raised eyebrow to it, which told me that Poe's stories, however dark they were, weren't to be taken entirely seriously. Of course, as children, we didn't really realize that he was also a pretty smart guy. The following is a piece which he wrote about Poe on the subject of style. There was hardly any public in America that could have understood what Poe was trying to do. The only serious literary culture was in Boston, where the high-minded transcendentalism which animated it rendered Poe anathema. Emerson called him the jingling man. But Poe thought literature in danger of corruption when its ends were other than literary, particularly when it fell into the didactic mode. There was no place in Boston, stiff with notions of social and religious reform, for a writer preoccupied with artistic integrity, clarity of effect, and purity of style. What is interesting about Poe's tales of ratiocination is that the intellect involved is successful in solving the problems it confronts. But still more interesting are those tales where the problem does not admit of solution, or where the mind of the narrator cannot control the conditions under which it is obliged to live. It was the French who were the first to see Poe's distinction. He was the most intelligent writer of his generation in America, though in describing him as intelligent, I use the word rather more in its French than its English sense. Poe was not intelligent about life. Knowledge of life and how under ordinary circumstances it is to be lived or endured form no part of his fiction. It is indeed a sign of this ignorance of life, this unintelligence about it, that Poe's heroes and narrators are themselves such intellectuals. For the essence of Poe's best tales is a perfectly conscious clairvoyance in which the intellect controls or attempts to control everything. Loss of intellectual control leads to madness or more frequently death. Life, therefore, is a matter of will. To remain intellectually conscious is to remain alive. Poe's heroes and narrators are always trying to extract from an infinity of variables the one or two elements which will give order amidst the chaos of possibility. The trick is to lay hold of those elements in which real meaning resides, in order to escape the confusion to which consciousness may be reduced in attempting to interpret the infinity of signs with which the external world bombards it. And yet the concentration which Poe can bring to his subject, the care with which he assembles his materials, and the clarity of his writing leave the reader content to admire the performance without troubling to question its substance. The hard brilliance of his style reflects the imagination of the reader and becomes the subject itself. The old adage that style reflects the man, le style c'est l'homme, takes on in the writings of Poe a conspicuously American dimension.
What I'd like to do this afternoon is add a few brushstrokes to the portrait of Richard that you all have come to know in its more finished form. My profoundly loving and persistently companionable friendship with Richard has lasted more than 6 decades. So this afternoon, I'd like to share a few thoughts and memories of those early moments when we were together at college, at Columbia College, from the time we first met in 1955 as sophomores to when we were roommates at Columbia in New York during our senior year in 1956 and 57, and then how we fared subsequently after graduation, with our young lives continuing to be strongly connected and our families intertwined. The letters we exchanged at those times are crucial in understanding Richard and his wonderful, then maturing sensibility and soul, and in some, his Richardness. This is a time when we were roommates. Richard had lived in the same dormitory room for 2 years with different roommates each year, both of whom had graduated, so I was delighted to accept his proposal that I share it with him for our final year. Surprisingly, Richard had become a fraternity brother of Alpha Delta Phi his freshman year, and while he spent that year living in the frat house, he very unsurprisingly soon distanced himself from it all and became aloof and unengaged with frat life for the rest of his college time. Our shared smallish room was in the attic of Hartley Hall, a campus dormitory of many stories overlooking Morningside Park, Harlem, and in the far distance, LaGuardia Airport, all of them potent symbols for 2 students of literature and culture in American society. The interior space was eccentric, and we both felt it might have the touch of a monk's chambers or the studious mustiness of Oxbridge rooms. However, we made some efforts to make it into a genuine scholar's den under its sloping eaves, which equally resembled a Parisian student's chambre de bonne. We each burdened our individual spaces in this smallish garret with books, literary reviews, newspapers, magazines, vinyl records, pipes, sherry. In short, our notion of an exotic student's lair. And we fulminated a lot, like 2 young curmudgeons in a pod, about all manner of topics, weighty and frivolous, egging each other on, a practice we carried on for 6 very satisfying decades, unabated. We were serious students. Each of us were, presciently, editors-in-chief of undergraduate publications, Richard of the Columbia Review, the college literary journal, and I of the Columbia Jester, the humor magazine. Our room was what passed for then as the nexus of a student literary empire. As such, we hosted occasional social events there on late Friday afternoons, organized, of course, by Richard, who was the nimble master of ceremonies, ever gracious, generous, and sharply intelligent. These featured sherry and nibbles for assorted young faculty and students, unusual for the time and place, and breaking all manner of rules of which we blithely made no effort to inform ourselves. Our digs were also the place of feverish study as our graduation year progressed, the air full of pipe smoke and the furious rattling of our Olivettis mixed with classical music as a constant companion. Richard particularly leaned toward the great masters of the classical tradition and had a particular fondness for Renaissance choral music. Our room resonated with the choirs of England singing Tallis and Byrd and Palestrina, and the devotion he held for his delight in what he deemed superior musical creation is reflected in an anecdote related to me by Roger Donald, a fellow American who was also at Clare on a Mellon Fellowship from Yale during the same 2 years as Richard. And this is Roger Donald writing. And while I was reading and listening to a work by one of those 19th century guys who, despite being ranked with the earlier classic composers, still loved a good melody, Richard, whose digs were across the hall from mine, entered my room without knocking, shook his head, and told me to turn off that unbearable sound. Being a serious but uninformed lover of music, I, in confusion, replied, "Gee, I thought it was pretty good stuff." Dick stared at his shoes, slowly shook his head, and asked, "If that truly is pretty good stuff, why do we mostly hear it in elevators or as the musical themes in dreadful, schlocky, sentimental movies?" Hey, come on, you can't blame the composer if schlocky folks listen to, and like the music, I retorted. Oh, yes, you can. In fact, it is proof positive that the music can only be as idiotic as the people who, God help us, enjoy it. He unbowed his head, stared at me, sighed, and almost in a whisper entreated, God help him. I thought for a moment and then told him he had been born a generation too late. Then you could have been the lead critic for The New Yorker, and your opinions and prose would have appeared alongside the warm, gracious wit of Kaufman, Thurber, Benchley, Parker, and so on. Dick's stern frown slowly disappeared, replaced by an ever-broadening smile. That smile. Thank you very much. I consider that's an extremely thoughtful compliment. And with that said, he spun around and left, quietly closing the door behind him. I got up, crossed the room, and turned off Claire de Lune, or was it the Bolero? I can't remember. So here is how Richard got to Clare College. This is something that I remember very, very sharply in our senior year. So Richard received a letter from the dean's office, Dean Chamberlain, as I remember, during the spring of 1957, the year of his and our upcoming graduation. This perplexed and worried Richard very much, fearing that he had run afoul in some way that would prevent his graduating, some infraction that he was ignorant of committing. So with considerable trepidation, he sat before the dean, a formal man, not given to putting his students at ease, who looked at his papers methodically for a long time to Richard and then addressed him and said to him, "How would you like to go to Cambridge?" Richard, very surprised, protested, "But I am going to Cambridge, to the graduate school at Harvard." No, the dean said, "the real Cambridge." Thus, the Kellett Fellowship was bestowed on Richard and changed the course of his life and produced many lives as well. So we exchanged had a nice epistolatory life for a while after we graduated. And so I've brought together some letters that we exchanged during during the year soon after our graduation. They chronicle the continuing development of a Quaker kid from the Midwest through Columbia, thence to Cambridge. I think Richard's American Quaker sensibility and qualities were the foundation for his easy transition to Britain and to what Allan Bennett would describe as the best qualities of being English: tolerant, kind, modest, decent, funny, suspicious of all grandiosities, and quietly egalitarian. So on the eve of a visit, soon after we had graduated, and he, not soon, but a few years after, a visit to the US where we would be meeting, and always mindful of being an American. This is a letter that he wrote in 12 June 1960. The thought of America makes me rebellious at the moment. I shuffle back and forth between thinking the present senile administration is precisely what the country deserves and fearing for the safety of us all, and letters from you and Andre, that is Andre Schifrin, who was also here at Clare, and his roommate then. Letters from you and Andre don't make me much more charitable toward my homeland, but we can fulminate together later. This, of course, could be written today. August 1960. I'm halfway through USA, the John Dos Passos novel, and Gene's finished Arrowsmith, neither of which do much to balance the lopsided sense of America that we got from several weeks in Ohio, Indiana, and Minnesota. How much I prefer England, but with a nagging sense of the limited length of time I'll be able to stay here. That. And then a few more. It really is pretty idle for, this is to me, and it expresses his concern and his generosity and friendship towards me and, of course, many others, and towards his family. It's one of the qualities that Allan Bennett has so beautifully thought of. It really is pretty idle for you to waste precious time over such foolishness. That is a job I had had immediately after I had come back from France, having studied. Foolishness, even with necessity pushing you. In a curious way, I never really worry much about you. You seem so alive despite your deadening surroundings, and more honest with yourself than most of us. Still, I should have thought you were good enough at your trade to practice it full time. I do hope you can manage to get yourself fired soon. A few more, one more. This was in April of 1961. I do at least feel for the first time in my life that I'm on the way to getting an education. Getting it takes a lot of time that should be devoted to the duller slogging of research, but I'm happy and don't really feel guilty about doing what is immediately profitable, financially or academically. And then as a postscript in 1961, he writes, Jean is pregnant, which may cramp our style a little. And then, okay, two more, sorry. And these are all funny. And then he said, on returning from a visit to the U.S., he said, we had a dandy vacation. I'm thinking of returning for a visit. I'm pondering it. He said, we had a dandy vacation in Provence last summer, and I'm not yet nostalgic enough for my lost youth to think a month in Cincinnati would do as an equivalent. And then finally, as his role as a tutor and as his concern for students and his engagement with students, he said, he wrote in 1973, he said, my being a tutor caught up with me, and I had a rash of silly problems and not so silly ones. I think I shall try harder to cultivate a practical approach to my students. Regular habits for you: early to bed, early to rise, cold showers, balanced diet, and just to cheer you up and mark your renewed purpose, a change of toothpaste. And I want to finish with a George Eliot rumination on friendship. which I think encompasses our long friendship. She writes, "A friend is one to whom one may pour out the contents of one's heart, chaff and grain, together, knowing that gentle hands will take and sift it, keep what is worth keeping, and with a breath of kindness blow the rest away."
I'm so glad that Ed conveyed how funny Richard was. Isabel Gooder said last night that the Schifrin-Gooder friendship is now into its third generation. And I think what I remember most is the humor and the jokes and the special teasing, especially from Ben and Stephen and Richard. So I was asked by Jean to read something funny to you all. And I'm very pleased. This letter was a family favorite. Ben remembers Richard reading it out loud many times. It was from Groucho Marx to Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers got wind of the fact that the Marx Brothers were planning a spoof of the film Casablanca. And they had their lawyer write to the Marx Brothers and say, cease and desist. And so Groucho wrote back a sort of cheeky letter, which I'm going to read to you now. Dear Warner Brothers, apparently there is more than one way of conquering a city and holding it as your own. For example, up to the time that we contemplated making this picture, I had no idea that the city of Casablanca belonged exclusively to Warner Brothers. However, it was only a few days after our announcement appeared that we received your long, ominous legal document warning us not to use the name Casablanca. I just don't understand your attitude. Even if you plan on re-releasing your picture, I'm sure that the average movie fan could in time learn to distinguish between Ingrid Bergman and Harpo. I don't know whether I could, but I would certainly like to try. You claim you own Casablanca and that no one else can use that name without your permission. What about Warner Brothers? Do you own that too? You probably have the right to use the name Warner, but what about Brothers? Professionally, we were brothers long before you were. We were touring the sticks as the Marx Brothers when Vitaphone was still a gleam in the inventor's eye. And even before us, there had been other brothers, the Smith Brothers, the Brothers Karamazov, Dan Brothers, an outfielder with Detroit, and Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? This was originally Brothers, Can You Spare a Dime? But this was spreading a dime pretty thin. So they threw out one brother, gave all the money to the other one, and whittled it down to Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Now, Jack, how about you? Do you maintain that yours is an original name? Well, it's not. It was used long before you were born. Offhand, I can think of two Jacks. There was Jack the Ripper, and he cut quite a figure in his day. The other was, as for you, Harry, you probably sign your checks sure in the belief that you are the first Harry of all time and that all other Harrys are imposters. I can think of two Harrys that preceded you. There was Lighthouse Harry of Revolutionary fame and a Harry Applebaum who lived on the corner of 93rd and Lex. Unfortunately, Applebaum wasn't too well known. The last I heard of him, he was selling neckties at Weber and Heilbronner. This all seems to add up to a pretty bitter tirade, but I assure you it's not meant to. I love Warners. Some of my best friends are Warner Brothers. It is even possible that I'm doing you an injustice. It wouldn't surprise me at all to discover that the heads of your legal department are unaware of this absurd dispute, for I am acquainted with many of them, and they are fine fellows with curly black hair, double-breasted suits, and a love of their fellow man that out-Soroyan. I have a hunch that this attempt to prevent us from using the title is the brainchild of some ferret-faced shyster serving a brief apprenticeship in your legal department. I know the type well, hot out of law school, hungry for success, and too ambitious to follow the natural laws of promotion. This bar sinister probably needled your attorneys, most of whom are fine fellows with curly black hair, double-breasted suits, etc., into attempting to enjoin us. Well, he won't get away with it. We'll fight him to the highest court. No pasty-faced legal adventurer is going to cause bad blood between the Warners and the Marxes. We are all brothers under the skin, and will remain friends till the last reel of A Night in Casablanca goes tumbling over the spool. Sincerely, Groucho Marx.
The evocations of Richard by Geoff and Edward this afternoon very much resonate with my own memories of Richard, but they also make me, like Lord Grabiner, sorry that I did not know him longer. My first meeting with Richard occurred when I was interviewed for the mastership at Clare in November 2002, or more accurately, as the senior fellow explained to me, an informal chat with the full fellowship in a packed Latimer room. I answered a question on admissions and access with a suitably bland, progressive answer, which ended with the statement, even Yale and Harvard have abandoned legacy admissions. This last sentence was greeted with a loud snort of derision from someone I identified subsequently as Richard. The sort of response that made it clear that Richard found it difficult to imagine that anybody could be so naive and so ill-informed. In fact, Richard was extremely kind to me in my early years as master. I soon learnt his opinion on what he considered to be the vandalism inflicted architecturally by the college on the bursary and the tutorial office. He tolerated what must have seemed to him inexplicable, that is, my unwillingness to exercise my ex officio right to sit on the wine committee. Instead, he solicitously asked if, like Geoffrey Elton, I wanted the committee to stock a supply of bourbon. He gently instructed me in the not always calm history of English Fellows in Clare. He chaired a memorable session in the Riley Auditorium on Siegfried Sassoon when the University Library secured the Sassoon papers. And later he helped entertain Jonathan Spence when Jonathan came back to Clare to receive his honorary degree. And all the time, he kept a protective eye on his protégés, the younger English Fellows, and let me know in no uncertain terms what I needed to do for them and about them to secure their futures. He was a legendary chair of the wine committee for many years, and with Peter Allinson, he supervised the creation of Clare's superb cellar. When he handed over as chair, finally, he produced a definitive policy that would sustain the long-term financial future of wine purchase in the college. And of course, as Tony Grabiner pointed out, the college and I benefited hugely from the grants from the Family Education Trust that he and Jean were associated with and which were made available to us, especially for the support of English teaching and of CTOs. The college which Richard joined as a Kellett Fellow from Columbia in 1957 was very different from today. Richard arrived along with Anya's father, Andre, and they arrived at the same time. Richard as a Kellett Fellow, Andre as a Mellon Fellow. They had rooms in Memorial Court because the college, as Andre recalled, with touching solicitude, had placed all of us Latin types, Americans, West Indians, Africans, in the one unit endowed with central heating. This was, of course, observed Andre, still an unusual phenomenon in England, and the architects had placed the pipes that were to replace radiators so deep inside the walls that the rooms themselves were rarely heated, though we suspected that the outside of the building was probably nice and cozy. Richard and Andre used the kitchens to avoid the incredibly bad food which the college apparently has always served. They shared with their fellow Americans careful dietetic advice on how to avoid scurvy within a modest budget. The next year, they shared rooms in Old Court where they planned for winter, as Admiral Perry must have. After rather despairing intellectually of their first year at Clare, Andre and Richard learned more in their second years they had in all their time as undergraduates in the United States, or would, in Andre's case, learn in graduate school. With a new master and a Barbara Hepworth in the garden, Clare, Andre concluded, which had been known for its athletes but not for its intellectual accomplishments, was beginning the transformation that would in time make it one of the top academic centres of the university. Richard would be a vital part of that transformation as a research fellow and fellow of the college. And that's where my greatest debt to Richard came in. The tradition of superb undergraduate teaching in English that he handed down. I always regarded the English Fellows as one of the jewels in the crown of the college's undergraduate teaching. What Richard handed down was a model of what dedicated teaching and no-nonsense pastoral care could achieve. A model which we attempted, not always successfully, to get other subjects to emulate. It was a remarkable team that Richard created. What was so distinctive in Richard's example was his sense of obligation to both the English faculty and the college, a dual obligation that is becoming increasingly rare in modern Cambridge. What Richard understood was that the faculty and the college depended on each other. He understood that the English faculty could not deliver the quality teaching which it prided itself on without the contribution of CTOs, a contribution that Richard believed that the faculty needed to recognize and not take for granted. The college needed to encourage and not deter its CTOs from taking on faculty chores, and that was the advice he was constantly giving me. I know that Richard was proud of that legacy of superb teaching to the college, and of course it's still there with Fred and Jackie and Anne and Tamara. It's one of the reasons to be immeasurably grateful to Richard. But it is also the legacy that Jean has given to this college, that force for benignity, as Edward so memorably described it. I owe a huge debt to Richard, and I owe an immeasurable debt also to Jean. Thank you very much.
And just to close, on behalf of the family, may I offer some thanks. To the Master and Fellows of Clare, thank you for permission to hold this celebration in the college, where Richard spent so much of his working life and which meant so much to him. We've had the unstinting and warm support of the Development Office throughout the preparation for today's celebration, of the catering staff, and of many other members of the college. We want to extend special thanks for the music we've heard today, organised by the Director of Music, Graham Ross, and Liz Kenny. The performers are all either Clare graduates or current undergraduates, which speaks for the continued strength of music in the college. And thanks to all who have come today. Many are long-standing friends from Cambridge, but many have come from much further afield, and we owe a special debt of recognition to Richard's very dear American friends, who have crossed the Atlantic to contribute to today's celebration. Jean, wife, mother, grandmother, and today's chief architect, whose production of these proceedings in honour of Richard is testament to one of those rare things, a great and enduring love. Finally, thank you all for making this such a positive, memorable, and truly collaborative occasion. We're now all invited to the Master's Lodge, where we may raise a glass to this former wine steward of the college, and, as Pop would have said, let the wild rumpus begin.